I think that gets me into the next topic I wanted to ask you guys about, because this has obviously been a pretty clear influence across your discography, no matter what kind of era of Kero Kero Bonito that we've been in, and that's been sort of video game music, which I find especially interesting, that influence, given even what Sarah was saying earlier with her last console being a PS2. Like how I don't know, like. How do you guys feel like video game music in general impacts your art and impacts your sound and impacts your aesthetic? And how do you feel like you incorporate those sounds into, what you do, and in a way, like, I don't know, stay current with what's going on in video game music, if you do at all?
Well, I think
oh, sorry, I will quickly say definitely one thing to say is that we're of a certain generation which we just had so many consoles around, especially Japanese ones,
Yeah, because
so we grew up with Nintendo just there, and then so for me personally, video game music is more deep in more than something I can go that it's like it's real in there without even me. It's in the fabric almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it seems like aesthetically. To go back to the reference Sarah was making earlier, when you guys do reference a piece of like video game composition, it does seem to come from a certain era. Like it does seem like evocative of more of like a Nintendo 64 kind of thing.
Well, it's funny, right? Because I could get really nerdy about this, so I will. And I think that well, firstly, yeah, as Jamie said, it's totally a generational thing. I mean, and I think that something I think about a lot is how KKB, there was a certain moment with KKB, or just us as musicians and artists, where we went from sort of aping the things that our sort of forebears and favorites were doing at the time, to, oh no, this is our generation. We grew up with things like 3D polygons and HTML and general MIDI and MySpace. So now we can explore our thing. But also, what I think is really interesting about the era of video game soundtracks, you described the N64 and the PS1 and all this stuff before that, all video game soundtracks before that, was that they really used proprietary sound hardware that was significantly less developed than, a CD player or some kind of streaming type system. So, for example, even the N64, even though it could stream CD quality sound, the sound format for the N64, uses that people would use things like MIDI files or load. To make an N64 soundtrack, you'd load your own sounds, put your own sounds into the ROM, and then you kind of recall them with the music data. And it's a similar thing with the SNES. And what that all means is that those soundtracks do have a specific sound style, because they're effectively being played off synthesizers. It's not like when you play a game now and the music is just some streaming. It could be anything that could be an audio file. The sound chips in old video game consoles are synthesizers. So it'd be like if I had to make a piece of music now just using my Korg DSS-1 or my Yamaha DX-7. And that is why video game soundtracks of that era and previous have such a distinctive sound. And actually, what that is so interesting about that is it's interesting from a synthesizer and production perspective, as much as, I mean, obviously the world building and the nostalgia is also interesting. But, what's super cool about the SNES soundtrack, like a SNES soundtrack like Earthbound, is that it's actually, superlative sampler music. There's not much music that pushes sampling, the art of sampling and sound manipulation, as hard as that soundtrack, because that's what they were working with. And I think that those techniques have always, appealed to us, partially because that's our history, but also just because, yeah, that stuff is pretty sick,
I didn't know that. I didn't know that about sort of the I guess the build of those sounds and the music in these games, but I guess that makes sense. You're not hearing sort of a sound file being played back to you off of the cartridge. You're literally hearing the cartridge like generate that music for you live in real time. It's just sort of like preset.
Exactly.
And it definitely speaks to us about the restriction of like just 4 tracks, or something like that. And that speaks to dance music as well. That speaks to so much that is at the heart of what we do. And things like Music 2000, like making a track just in the box, like you would in Logic or Ableton, but on your PlayStation. That ended up, you know, so much music that we are big fans of as well, like like real London stuff, like even like some of the early grime stuff. It's all done on that Music 2000.
Definitely.
So it's all connected, really. It's just all connected.
Yeah, that's really interesting because you can totally compare it to the process of you know, early London grime music, or the kind of sample usage or limitations of music like early Chicago house or early New York house or any of that kind of stuff. And also another interesting thing on that tip is that, and related to all of this, I think, is that the N64, that's 5th generation, right? That was the last generation of home video game consoles where this was the case. From the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox onward, you would just have streaming music. I mean, actually, I think there might be sound formats, but essentially, you know, the GameCube, those EA games, like the FIFA games, they will just have songs, like songs that we know.
Yeah.
Because at that point, the technology is powerful enough just to play back. So actually, it's interesting because we were almost like our gen was the sort of frontier of that. You know, people talk about the end of history and this sort of Mark Fisher type philosophy, and in a weird way, that technology does tie into that. It's like that was the last time video game sound chips were synthesizers instead of just like MP3 players, basically. And yeah, it's funny. It's funny that we should take that to heart in that context.
Yeah. No, I mean, what you're speaking to technologically, I just had an aha moment in regards to that. I don't know how exactly sort of the copyright or ownership of any of these sounds sort of like cuts, but you made me think of a time back in college when I had just out of the blue, because it was required, taken a music elective, and I decided to take a piano class. And inside the class, they had maybe 20 of these in a row, these Yamaha keyboards that seemed like, you know, very late 90s, early 2000s. And at least like a third of the patches in those, you know, very formal looking keyboards, which, you know, you may see like on the stage at a college, you know, sort of recital sort of thing, were the exact synth patches from, or that, you know, you would have heard during some moments like opening a chest, fairy water, you know, spot, the exact patches that you would get out of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And I was like, whoa, crazy. Yeah. This is like the exact harp sound. And, you know, of course, nobody else in the class knew that. So there was no one to talk about with it. You know what I mean? But it was a really cool thing.
It's fine. You're talking to the people in the class who did know that, I think. And like, it's funny because actually there's an amazing database that someone has made. It's viewable online, where some people have compiled lists of recognizable sounds used in video games. So it's like a big list. I think I tweeted it out once, and it's like people have literally identified, oh, this sound in this song is patch 108 from the Roland JV 1010 or whatever. Oh, cool. And like, it's crazy. And not only is it fascinating, but actually it's I think a really underrated aspect of musicology in general, that most pop music is subject to exactly the same kind of technological development and kind of osmosis, maybe. So for something like the young chop snare, I mean, that's exactly the same thing, except that it's not a video game example. It's just a snare that you hear coming out of people's cars all the time when you walk down the street, or things like certain, you know, there was an article on Pitchfork about the loom bird sample that's in a load of rave music and stuff like this. And that I think is a really underrated but really central aspect of how pop music culture keeps moving.
Thank you very much for watching this interview clip over on TND Streams. To see the full interview, click on the video link next to my head or down below, or hit up the link to subscribe to the channel or see our Patreon page to support what we do and get some extra bonus monthly content in the process. Anthony Fantano, forever.